Welcome. Today we resume our studies in the Gospel of Mark. And as I suggested in our last study, with these verses we reach a pivotal point in Mark's story. So without further ado, let me read chapter 8, verses 27 to 38, where Mark tells us, Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, Jesus asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anybody about him, and he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." Now, Mark rarely gives us a clear timeline, and it's easy to assume that all the events that he describes up to this point occupied merely a few weeks. But a careful study of the various accounts of Jesus' life reveals that this is not in fact the case. In fact, by the time the present incident occurs, it would seem that Jesus had been with his disciples for 2.5 years or so. So they'd heard many of his sermons, seen far more of what he had done than Mark tells us, and they had lived with him and received his private instruction many, many times. But now comes the big moment. Jesus wants to know whether they have really understood him from the things that they have seen and heard. So once again, Jesus, and of course Mark, is addressing the question of discipleship, of what it means to follow him. This, as we have seen in our recent studies, has increasingly been the emphasis of this gospel. What were the disciples and what are we to make of Jesus? How well have we processed our knowledge about him? Now, the first thing that draws our attention is Peter's great statement, which we might assume was the result of late-night discussions among the disciples, perhaps around a hearth. So Peter, apparently the spokesman for the 12, answers the question that Jesus asks, "Who do you think I am?" And his answer is spot on. Peter says that Jesus is the Messiah. So Jesus is not just another great person, he's unique. He's the promised deliverer. And in Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, we're told that Peter added that Jesus was the Son of God. And again, Jesus clearly agrees. He's not wasted all his miracles and teaching in vain. They have got it. Well, perhaps we too have got this far. However, even if we have got this far, we can still get it all wrong about Jesus. And this is the point of Jesus' teaching in the central section of our passage. What Jesus seeks to do is to explain to the disciples and, of course, to us, the implications of Peter's confession. And these appear dark indeed. Jesus says, "Can I remind you that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again?" Peter, however, perhaps flushed with success after having been the spokesperson of God a moment or two before, contradicts Jesus. In response, we're told, Jesus whirls around on him, the language in Mark is very strong, and charges Peter with one of the most serious offences that anyone has ever had to face. Peter had sunk back to the level of his human presuppositions. A moment or two earlier he had been the Lord's prophet, but now Jesus tells him he was demonically inspired. So what's going on here? I think in the remainder of the passage Jesus helps both his first followers and those of us who are or may be considering following him to understand what following him really means. First of all, Jesus tells us that his death is fundamental to his role as the promised deliverer. He stresses this by saying that this was absolutely necessary. Now, Jesus does not spell out here why this was the case. However, those promises that God had made over the centuries of a coming deliverer had been made against a backdrop in which human beings had estranged themselves from God through rebelling against him. Created by God, they were now his enemies and subject to his righteous anger. The coming deliverer would need, therefore, to be able to resolve this problem that lies at the very heart of all human existence. And Jesus says he must die to achieve this. The rest of the New Testament is largely devoted to explaining this in greater detail, but it always insists that it was necessary for Jesus to die for us to be reconciled to God. This was doubtless very different from Peter and the disciples' expectations of the Messiah, but it is the heart of the Christian message. Have you grasped it? Have I? The second point that Jesus makes is that if Jesus must die, so as his disciples must we. Now, Peter doubtless thought that being the spokesperson of the Messiah's band would bring considerable personal favour and blessing. It promised to be a good life. But Jesus offers a very different picture. To follow Jesus, to benefit from what he has done for us, requires self-denial, a readiness to die to ourselves with all the pain and suffering that might involve, and to single-mindedly follow him for the rest of our lives. Alive to him, dead to ourselves. This was Jesus' message. You might almost think that Jesus didn't want disciples. This is not a great sales pitch, but it is still central to Jesus' message. To be all for Jesus means abandoning everything in ourselves that is not consistent with following his every step. Are we ready for this? But we cannot end this study without noticing that Jesus teaches that while we have to abandon everything that we can never hold on to, he also stresses that we gain those things that are of lasting and eternal character and bring the satisfaction that the human being longs for but cannot find except as a disciple of Jesus. Put then another way, it's a no-brainer to follow in Jesus. Yes, we have to give up ourselves to him, but only so that he can bestow upon us unimaginable blessings. Put crudely, it makes good business sense to follow Jesus. So there we have it. Have we got it right about Jesus? And what are we going to do about it? Two paths stand before us, but which one will you and I follow?